Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of The Strategy Gap. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Joe.
And today, joining us all the way from beautiful LA is Jordan Gadd. Jordan is the Chief of Staff at Heluna Health and has an extensive experience covering different areas of strategy and strategic planning in both the health sector as well as education. So, Jordan, welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks for having me.
So, Jordan, one thing I wanted to start off with is where you work at Heluna Health. And I think a lot of people hearing that name may think more traditionally about healthcare and hospitals and health systems, but the type of work that you do at Heluna Health is much, much more than that. So do you mind giving a quick overview of the type of work that you do at Heluna Health and how you support the greater community there?
Great. Yes, thanks for that question. So Heluna Health is a public health nonprofit. We're based in Los Angeles, and we've been around for about 50 years. We offer both direct public health services and programs, and we also support a range of partners in about 500 different public health projects each year, where we provide fiscal sponsorship, contracts and grants management, human resource services, so that a range of public health programs can really focus on serving their communities and executing their public health mission. We really think of ourselves as sort of the nonprofit public health infrastructure support. And we work in a range of areas from maternal and child health to the public health workforce, outbreak community preparedness, disease prevention, early literacy. So we really run the gamut in terms of focusing on the health of populations, whereas healthcare often focuses more on the health and wellness of individuals.
In your role as Chief of Staff, I think that it would be helpful to walk through that just at a general level, and then I have a direct question around the role within strategy execution. But generally speaking, a Chief of Staff in an organization like yours, what does the day-to-day look like, as well as we'll get to the strategy execution piece, but touching upon what your role is in that as well would be helpful for our audience.
Yep. So I've been serving in Chief of Staff roles for about 10 years in a variety of different organizations and settings, from education to now public health. And while the role can vary depending on the organization and the team you're working with, I mean, ultimately, a Chief of Staff is there as an extender, a thought partner, an advisor to the Chief Executive, to the leadership team, and working across the organization. Oftentimes you find within organizations that work happens within departments, within silos, and sometimes the CEO may be the only individual that's kind of really looking truly across the organization, across those silos, and making connections and facilitating change. And chiefs of staff are really sort of that second position that can look across the organization. They may be the only other person that sees what the CEO is seeing. And so they can be both a support to the CEO and the entire organization in ensuring collaboration, communication, facilitation across areas, because we know that that's what where sort of the real work happens. And so I think we've also seen a great increase in the number of chiefs of staffs in a wide range of companies. You tend to think of chief of staff in the political role. You think of the West Wing and the sort of president's chief of staff. That's kind of the archetype. But you now find them in tech startups, in public health. You find them in education. You're finding them in a range of settings, because I think CEOs, management teams, organizations are really seeing the benefits that chiefs of staff bring to organizations in terms of executing on goals.
It's funny you say that, because I think there was an article pretty famously in the last 2 years. It was titled "The Rise of the Chief of Staff," and it spoke to what you just mentioned, which it was very specific to certain sectors, but now becoming more and more popular. And I had the pleasure of actually visiting Heluna Health and seeing Jordan in action. So I have a different perspective on seeing this, because to Jordan's point, I've interacted over the last 10 years at Achieve It with a handful of chief of staffs, but not in the same capacity. So I work with Jordan very closely to get ready for the on-site visit we were going to do and review the strategic plan. And he was my main point of contact, and also seeing him in action in the room, to the point he made, it was the C-suite, the leadership team, and it was a very collaborative thing. And you can see that a lot of questions around next steps and big picture and things like that were definitely directed towards Jordan, because he was orchestrating the strategic planning process. And I must say, it was very nice to see you in action, and the day went very, very smoothly because you had a handle on it. I'm assuming that took time to get as good as that. You've been doing it 10 years. So if you wouldn't mind sharing with folks, like, how did you end up in a place where that smoothness is there and that trust is built? What have you learned along the way? What worked, what didn't work, so that you are truly facilitating true strategic execution? How did you get there?
Yep. I mean, I tend to think of there are a few key tenets of being a chief of staff. One is sort of doing. You've got to roll up your sleeves and do the work. Being a facilitator, being sort of a facilitator across silos, across areas, being a facilitator of change, and then connector, and sort of connecting dots, helping people see sort of how their work rolls up to the larger mission. And I think some things that I found that have helped me be successful. First is really knowing the mission and believing in the mission of the organization. I mean, I've been fortunate in my career to work for mission-driven organizations. That's what kind of fuels me in my work, and knowing that the work I'm doing is helping sort of a greater good, serving the community, making an impact in people's lives. So starting with mission, I think, is important, because I think often you will find that is a key connector for all of the people that you're working with, from the CEO to the C-suite to sort of all levels of the organization, is that they're there in mission-driven organizations because they believe in that mission. So you've got to start with that place and find a connection there. I think from there, it really is all about relationship building, and really sort of figuring out what are the needs, the strengths from all of the team members, and how can I sort of augment, support, enhance what everyone sort of individually is doing and what everyone is collectively doing. I think the chief of staff is often sort of the utility player on the field, or sort of, I like to say, people ask me what my job is, that sort of that one line in everyone's job description at the end, it's other duties as assigned. That oftentimes is truly the chief of staff's job description. So I think those are a couple of areas where I've found have helped me be successful in this role, but I think also just being able to pivot and adjust, knowing that each sort of team you're working with is going to have different needs, and I have to kind of step in and meet those needs maybe in different ways for different settings.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I love how you described it as, being able to be a doer, a facilitator, and a connector. We tend to talk about things in a similar vein about the different levels of planning and execution. And the way we talk about it is you have the architects at the top that are, building the plans. You have the doers at the bottom, but then you have that translator in the middle that's kind of working across those teams. But it seems like chief of staff at times is each one of those components. Yeah. Is it, in your experience, either now or previously, does it tend to be pretty split between those three roles, or is it more a facilitator, more a connector, more a doer at any point in time?
Yeah, I think that's a great point and a great way to connect it over to sort of the strategy archetype. I think it really depends on the project or initiative that one is working on, and sort of the needs of the project and the needs of the team. I certainly have found myself leaning into each one of those roles at often even in different times of the day, depending on what I'm focusing on. Sort of, I'll be in the doing mode for a couple of hours and then shifting into facilitation for a couple of hours. So I'd say, overall, probably a pretty even breakdown, but really dependent on the project.
And you mentioned the idea of being mission driven. So I was with helping facilitate with a school district yesterday in Illinois, and typically mission driven organizations are the ones that are most resource constrained, right? And so the question I always get is it better, do you think, to be mission driven and have fewer resources and people that really care and will maybe move mountains, knowing that could be a limiting factor at some point? Or have you seen other organizations that maybe are less mission driven? They are selling widgets, to lack of a better term, but they have more resources. In your experience, who gets more done?
So I think this is exactly where strategy and strategy execution comes into play. And this is why, even being in a nonprofit setting in a mission-driven organization, strategy is so essential, because it's sort of the leverage point to increase our impact in, as you say, a resource-constrained environment. If you're not thinking longer term about where you can have the greatest impact, how you can use your resources most effectively, even limited resources, then you're not fully living up to your mission and sort of the greatest impact that you can be making. And so I think that's why at Heluna Health, we so highly value strategy and having good strategic planning processes, good fiscal year goal processes, good metrics, because ultimately that's our sort of measure of accountability for our nonprofit mission and for the impact that we're making in communities every day.
Well, yeah, and even I say that the flip side of that is even the goals, right? You're not doing all this to sell more widgets or to increase profit. I mean, at Heluna Health, it's literally saving lives and helping those in the community. So in that case, strategy absolutely needs to be important.
Yeah.
So going back a little bit to kind of how you talked about the role of chief of staff and enabling strategy to ultimately achieve your mission. Talk about what you're doing now, but I'd love to kind of spend a little bit of time for people that maybe aren't in the stage that you are now and trying to think, how do we actually bridge that gap? So what was one of the initial steps that you took as you either came into this role or previous chief of staff role, or you identified, we have this not bad, but more historical planning structure that's top down, and it's not really connecting people across. What were some of the initial steps you took across the teams to bridge that gap?
Sure. Yeah. So when I arrived here, we had a fiscal year planning process that was a little bit siloed, and the overall timeline of the process kind of seemed a little bit late in the game, and the goals were being set sort of finalized once the fiscal year had started, and it wasn't aligned with our fiscal year budget process. So I kind of, taking stock in the first 6 months, identified some gaps and then put in proposals in place to kind of move up the timeline and offer opportunity in this first year, offer opportunities to at least share out department goals sort of with the full team so that there was awareness of what everyone else's goals were for the sake of awareness, information sharing, finding out further opportunities for collaboration or for synergy, just to ensure alignment. And so in that first year, we were able to kind of move up the timeline a little bit and have a little bit more sharing of goals across the organization. But I knew that there was still more work to be done. And so thankfully, leadership was open to further change and put in some processes to make it better for the second year could go around.
You mentioned the idea of sharing of goals, so knowing what we're working towards, but considering the type of work that you're doing with over 500 projects impacting the community directly, how have you, if at all, incorporated the idea of sharing the outcomes of all the work you're doing? Because you're in a unique position where a lot of time and effort and resources are placed into a particular community program, and you might have changed lives, like literally changed lives every day. How do you then maybe showcase those successes to make sure that people realize that the strategic plan is not just a piece of paper, it is leading to an outcome that looks like this, and that person's name is Amy, and here's how her life has been impacted by your hard work. How have you been able to leverage that to make your execution even better?
Yep. So I can share sort of 3 different ways that we really think about sharing the successes of our strategic planning work and our work in general. So the first, which is a little bit more internal facing, is that we do regularly share out with our headquarters team and our board sort of quarterly progress on our strategic plan, both in terms of the percent of tactics we're achieving. Proud to say we've been at about 90% plus annual achievement of tactics, or tactics that are on track towards their sort of plan fiscal year 25 year end goals. But below that, we also share like what are the outcomes, what are the successes, what is sort of the content, what are the examples of sort of what's come out of the strategic plan, not just the numbers, because while the numbers are great, sort of what actual changes, what new programs have been implemented, what new initiatives have been implemented, what is the evidence that we're actually achieving sort of the strategic plan goals, because we set those for a reason. So that's sort of the internal kind of measurement piece. Then we also, to sort of introduce our internal sort of staff to the programs, sort of at our monthly all staff meetings, we invite program leaders to come in and share a bit about what their program is, who it impacts, the community it serves. So this both is an education on sort of the program partners within Heluna Health, but it's also a public health education piece because we're learning about HIV programs, we're learning about food and nutrition programs. So that's another kind of internal one. And then the external one, through our advancement and strategic communications team, we publish an annual impact report that has spotlight stories of programs, initiatives that have deep community impact and that are sort of tied to strategic plan goals and strategies. And so that's sort of our main external facing piece. We're really showing the great work that we're doing and the impact that we're making.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say you've given 4 examples, the 3 internal, 1 external, that all point to the idea of authentic storytelling. I mean, everybody out there today talks about you have to be authentic. You can't do some canned story, and not to bring into the politics, but there's a reason why State of the Union, whatever it is, it is full of stories where they'll bring the folks in that they've been impacted by a program, and it does resonate. And depending on the story, not a dry eye in the house, but we want to make sure that what we're seeing on paper actually translates into actual outcomes and making it a real story with a name. I bring it up a lot, but I haven't seen a ton of clients really lean into it as hard as you're mentioning. So I think that's something for our listeners to really glean from this, is that storytelling takes time to get good at, but it is so powerful. And hopefully, I mean, I don't know, I may be speaking out of turn, but I'm sure with the annual impact report and all that, maybe it opens up other opportunities for funding and sources of help, because people are like, I'm inspired, I want to chip in. Have you seen that as well?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's the sort of our desire to authentically communicate the impact we're making, but there's also, as a mission-driven organization, the desire to make greater impact through garnering additional resources for our programs and initiatives, building out new partnerships. We've been primarily California-based, though with some national reach historically. And so there's the desire that we can bring the work that we've done successfully in California to other regions, to other states. And so absolutely our sort of communication, our external facing communications are all about enhancing our reputation and awareness so that we can drive greater impact.
That's awesome. I had almost the same exact thought as Joe, is that certainly there are many organizations that don't do any of this, but all 4 of them are great examples. And you see more and more organizations doing the kind of internal high-level reporting and then the external reporting. But for those that aren't yet to that story level component of bringing in those program leaders and having them talk about the front lines and what they're accomplishing, what does that process look like? Or how do you select who these people are? Is it during programs? Is it after programs? Talk us through what that looks like in real life.
Yeah. So we've got a great contracts and grants team that really sort of serves as the lead with our programs, working with our colleagues in accounting and human resources, who kind of are the core client support for all of the programs that we partner with. And so these teams have such a great pulse on the work being done in each of these 500 different projects. So honestly, this is where we partner with our colleagues to say, what's the great work that's going on? Tell me about like which programs have sort of had great successes recently, which ones maybe haven't we showcased yet that we should be showcasing. So just asking those kinds of questions of those that are sort of on the front lines working with our programs has helped us figure out which stories to spotlight, which programs to highlight, and which issues, I mean, public health issues do we want to surface because they're timely, and we want to make sure that people are aware of sort of what's cutting edge in public health.
And I imagine the program leaders enjoy it, or is it, kind of wrestling with them sometimes?
No, I mean, scheduling is a challenge for everyone. Sure. We're all busy, but no, I think we've seen great interest from the program leads, and then the sort of the feedback and comments. I mean, you see them in the Zoom chats whenever we do this from our team, just thanking the program for the work that they're doing, saying they weren't they didn't quite know maybe at first the full breadth and depth of the impact that was being made. And so you see that it's a sort of a two-way street there, and that the program leads are excited and interested to share this information, and our team is really excited to receive it and to then sort of have that context and sort of further understanding of sort of why we're doing what we're doing to support the great work that's going on in the community.
And shout out to grant writers, right? It's one of the toughest jobs. I did it a little bit in college working for a politician. And I mean, it was tough, and stakes are high, no room for error. It's definitely, so if you ever run into a grant writer, give them a hug, because it's definitely a tough gig. But if they do their job effectively, it has a direct impact on a lot of great things. So just want to make that quick point. But to switch gears, we're going to ask a question a little bit, not to ruin it at the end here. We're going to say, what could potentially, what you've learned maybe in your current role. But I think with the chief of staff role being so, it's new and it's old at the same time. It's been around a while, but it is going through a whole revolution and renaissance. If somebody's listening to this right now and they're like, you know what, that sounds like a great career choice. What would you recommend somebody to get into it, and maybe what led you to the profession to begin with, since you've been doing it for over a decade?
Yeah. So I'll start with what led me into it. And it was a little bit happenstance, but it started with communication. So I was leading and starting up the communications function for a unit at a university. And through that, I was able to learn all about the programs that we offer, the impact and sort of that we were having in the community, our faculty, their research. So I learned a lot about what the organization does, and I built relationships across the organization just in doing that work. And so that kind of led to, I was well positioned because I had the knowledge, the relationships, and sort of some of the strategic thinking to kind of step into an initial chief of staff role. And then I think from there, it was about figuring it out as you're going through it, how your positionality fits in within the organization, what unique skills and experiences you do bring. And then, as I talked about a little bit earlier, sort of that ability to adjust and pivot to kind of meet the needs of the team, of the organization at that moment. And it's definitely been an evolution. I mean, even 10 years in, I still am learning new things every day. That's what excites me about the work that I do. Part of that, the shift from education to public health, was a big learning curve, but that was probably one of the most exciting things about the shift, was that opportunity to learn about a new field. So if we want to talk about sort of characteristics or things to look for, that's sort of that appetite for,
let's do it.
For sort of great characteristics that I think would make a successful chief of staff would be a great appetite for information, for knowledge about the organization, about the field that it's in, thinking about sort of, you think of the traditional SWOT analysis, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats towards the organization, so that you're kind of thinking both of that big picture mission-driven lens, but also being able to drill down into detail. I think that's sort of another successful trait, is being able to pivot back and forth between attention to detail, but always keeping in mind that big picture vision of why you are doing this work, why an organization is doing that work. And then in terms of tips, if someone was thinking about this as a career, I think first and foremost would be to find a current or chief of staff or someone who's had that role and talk with them. I think there's nothing that can replicate that type of experience. And I mean, a tool like LinkedIn offers a great opportunity to find and connect with chiefs of staff in that way. And the other great, I will say, there are a number of communities for chiefs of staff out there right now, including sort of some education programs. I can say, as someone who's been doing this work for 10 years, these are newer to the field. These did not exist 3, 4, 5 years ago. So it's great to see that. I think that there's now sort of this ecosystem of support for this career where that just didn't exist previously, or at least didn't exist in the same way that it does today.
Got it. A quick 2-part follow-up to that. Talking about kind of how do you get into the chief of staff role. What's generally the path after that? Is if someone, do they normally go into CEO role? Does it lend itself to another position? And then kind of continuing that, what do you see as the future of the chief of staff position as a whole?
Yeah. I think by for chiefs of staff, I think sort of future career directions in many ways are multiple. I mean, traditionally, yes, there's the CEO route, the chief operating officer or chief administrative officer route. Oftentimes they will end up sort of maybe leading a particular function, sort of maybe head of talent or head of revenue. But they've got the great lens of knowing the full organization, or knowing, even if they're shifting to a new organization, knowing that they need to know the full organization and not necessarily sort of their vertical that they're leading. And sorry, the second part of the question.
What do you see as the future of the chief of staff position as a whole? You know, it's exploded in growth. How do you see that continuing to grow or evolving, or whatever the case may be?
Yeah. So I think the future of the chief of staff position will continue to grow. I think it will probably become a more normalized member of the C-suite. I think another great area of growth is that it's increasing not just at the chief executive level, but within sort of department leads. So you may have chief of staff to the chief human resources officer, or chief of staff to the dean of a college or school. So that you're seeing chiefs of staff at multiple levels throughout the organization. And actually, I think that's a tremendous opportunity, because oftentimes chiefs of staff find themselves are the only one in the organization. There's no one else like them. And that can be at times sort of isolating or challenging. But if you've got within one company a cadre of chiefs of staff, I think there's real opportunity for greater impact within the organization, because they all kind of understand their unique roles and can connect across that and serve the organization better. And I think the other sort of point about the future of the chief of staff is just sort of the further professionalization of the role, just in that there are more networking groups, associations, formal trainings, benchmarking of salaries and job responsibilities, and the different levels and types of chiefs of staff depending on experience and skills. And so I think just as we've seen other positions kind of grow into a more formal and well-known position, I think that will probably be true for the chief of staff as well.
Excellent. And as mentioned, I've had the pleasure of working with you and seeing how you interface with the organization. And when people come to Achieve It, like new employees, let's say that we're hiring, they ask, like, what do our most successful clients look like? And I typically tell them they have three things. They have a plan, which sounds pretty basic, but there's got to be some sort of plan. You'd be surprised. Mm-hmm. And that plan has to be pretty good. It has to have all the elements that we always talk about, due dates and accountable parties, but have to have that. There has to be somebody who's championing the project, somebody that's kind of day-to-day, that's taking on the reins of that. And there has to be some executive support. It has to be greater than zero. And what I've seen with chief of staff, folks that have that role and clients that have interfaced, it ensures the plan's going to be good, because typically it's a project that you're shepherding. And then also you're the person that's making sure you're coordinating with all senior leaders and everybody else. So it's a great thing, especially with strategy execution, is it ticks basically two boxes off the bat if a chief of staff is doing their role and being in there. So it's been really great to see that it's not always as smooth as I've seen with you and your organization, mainly because of the three things that are necessary to have a true owner in somebody like you or anybody who has the chief of staff role. So for our listeners, it really does add some horsepower to your execution efforts, especially if you've had struggled in the past. If you're really honest with yourself, you're missing one of those three. How do you get all three? It sounds like a good avenue would be the creation of a chief of staff, or potentially the expansion of some responsibilities to mirror that. But I just wanted to throw that out there as a real kind of connecting thing that I've seen, and basically in your career coming together. And that was very, very helpful.
Yeah, well, Jordan, we definitely appreciate all the insights and advice. I learned a lot. I didn't know nearly this much about chiefs of staffs beforehand and the role they played in strategy execution. So I know listeners will love it, and I hope that by listening to this, we have a couple of future chiefs of staffs coming out of this podcast. So before we close out, just had one final question. And if you were to think about your journey as a chief of staff, your journey in changing these organizational planning execution models, if you could think about everything you'd learn and had to go back to your first role as a chief of staff or your first time leading this process, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give yourself?
Yeah. I think the most important part about the chief of staff role, about strategic planning and strategy execution in general, and the chief of staff's role in that in particular, really is relationship building. You can have the best plan on paper. You can have the tools to track it. You can have the resources, but if you don't have the relationships amongst the team and the larger team, not just the executive team, but the larger team that's carrying out this work, you're not going to be as successful. And so I think just ensuring that there are opportunities and, if needed, processes and systems just to ensure that relationships are built, that relationships are strong. I think that goes a long way to just really great strategy execution. Even it sort of builds on all of the pieces that are needed.
Love it. I think that's the perfect way to cap it and summarize your role and role of chief of staff. So Jordan, thank you so much for being on the show today, and look forward to connecting again soon.
Great. Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Thanks, Jordan.